We are now on the last panel, the political panel, moving forward on reform. My name is Elaine McCoy. I sit as an independent senator representing Alberta. And I'm very impressed with the quality of the discussions that we've heard last night and today over the future of the Senate. I think the conversations will continue to inform and enrich us as we go forward. And as I'm pleased to report as well, there is a movement within the Senate itself who is, and Andrew Hurd and others from the last panel will be thrilled to hear, we are moving a number of initiatives forward. We have and reframed our discussions by talking about modernizing the Senate, bringing the Senate into the 21st century, and many of those initiatives will bear fruit, but the fruit will be all the richer for our participation in conversations like this. And indeed, I asked Arisia if this wonderful institution, Center for Constitutional Studies here at U of A wouldn't mind adopting us, because I think it would only help us as we move forward. I want to say, just to give a little context, I do notice a couple of faces in the audience and elsewhere here today that have not had the full benefit of listening to all of the conversations that we've enjoyed for the past 24 hours. So just to give a little context, I think Kim Campbell really did ask the central question: what do we want the Senate to do? What is the purpose of the Senate? And when we figure that out, what is the job description of the Senate, then we can begin to move forward on making sure that our ideal Senate performs well. I will say that the job description of the Senate, we have about 6 different roles to play. And just quickly let me outline what they are, and to make sure that I didn't forget any of them, I've written them down. Some of them have been discussed and some of them haven't. There is the representation of the region. There is the representation of minorities and other groups. From that has evolved over the 150 years the support of causes that entail the examination and elaboration of public policies. There is a role that very few people talk about, and that is our international role, and particularly, you might call it parliamentary diplomacy. But then there is the oversight of government action and our legislative function. What inevitably ends up being the focus of discussion is these last two, the legislative and the oversight of government. And what I find fascinating is how even those two are often confused in the discussion. The legislative function, I can understand that one being discussed and recognized more often than not, because that's the one that's most visible. What I find more interesting is the blurring of lines between the legislative and the executive functions of our government. Now, partly that's because of the way we've evolved again, and in the Westminster system. In fact, the government of Canada is comprised of the cabinet. In practice, the cabinet is the government. We very rarely remember that. We think of the government as being all of these MPs that are the same, belong to the same party as the person who leads and forms the cabinet, which is the Prime Minister. So, in fact, in many ways, the legislative function of overseeing the executive function from the House of Commons perspective, has, in Senator Lowell Murray's continuous refrain, been abdicated. And that's through party discipline, and that's because they're a confidence chamber. That, it be that as it may, is another subject for discussion, but it needs to be talked about in context. Because then when you start to look at the Senate, and you say, well, you need to be a counterweight to the House of Commons. We were never designed to be a counterweight to the House of Commons. We were designed to be a counterweight to government and to the tyranny of the majority led by the government. So we need to be, in my view, quite clear. There are some fallouts, it seems to me, from this, and that is, as I say, our legislative function, we were never meant to be a government. We were never meant to be a rival to the government. And some may argue, and some have argued strenuously, that the beginning of a desire for Senate reform did start 30 years ago. But it started with Senator McEachern, a liberal senator, freshly out of the House of Commons, indeed freshly out of cabinet, freshly out of power, freshly out of government, who declared that he would run the government from the Senate. Well, that gave quite an impetus for cry for Senate reform, which maybe we've forgotten. There's another, I think, and this one is also often blurred and not talked about enough, although the panel just before us did begin to discuss it, and that is the control of Prime Minister's office on the Senate itself. And the examples that Senator Cowan gave, and also the examples that were laid out in the 90-page affidavit of the RCMP officer who was investigating and reporting out on the Duffy debacle, makes very clear that the Prime Minister's office is, through unelected officials, party officials, staffers, controlling senators. And that should be a cause of considerable concern. But it seems to me that that piece of the conversation has not been addressed as fully as it might be. But so those are, to give the context, this afternoon I rather suspect on this panel we are going to be focusing on these very two areas, the legislative and to some extent, no doubt, given our panelists' backgrounds, the experience as a member of executive and also certainly a member of the House of Commons, and the role of the House of Commons and how it is or is not being used to oversee government and government executive functions. So we have with us Stephane Dion, whom we all know is one of our preeminent thinkers in Canada, and we always look forward to hearing from him. We have James Rajotte, and I don't think I need to introduce him any more fully than you did, Anne, and we all absolutely endorse your views. And Craig Scott, who is from Ontario, NDP. We don't know you as well, Craig, but we look forward to the freshness of your ideas. So would you please welcome these three panelists. Here you go.
Thank you very much, Senator. We'll go this way. Thank you, Senator. It's a pleasure to share another panel with Greg. Too many to count them now. But it's the first time I have this honor to do it with Mr. Rajotte. And what Madame McClellan has said is very true. We have here an MP that is well respected from both sides of the House, so it's a pleasure. What I will argue is that there is only one Senate reform that is both desirable and doable. And it is the Justin Trudeau's one. We have three bold Senate reform that has been on the table: elect it, abolish it, or make it independent. And only the third one is achievable. I'm not saying it's the only thing we need to do. I would just want to say that all the reforms we have spoken about since the beginning of today, none of them, in fact, would be really possible without the Trudeau reform. I have a text that the title is Time for Boldness on Senate Reform, Time for the Trudeau Plan. J'ai une version française aussi du texte pour ceux qui s'intéresseraient, mais je ferai la présentation en anglais. Why abolition and election are not doable. Why it's not doable? It's because you will need constitutional amendments. And there is no consensus among provinces for elections. And then you need the 750. And there is no unanimity for abolition. In addition to it, the province of Quebec has said there is no way it will accept to negotiate the Constitution only on the Senate. And you have the Regional Act, Veto Act, Regional Veto Act that gives a veto to the 5 regions of our country. So it will not happen. In addition to it, I would say elections without other institutional changes would be a major mistake. Why? Because today, the distribution of seats in the Senate for each province underrepresent this province, Alberta, and British Columbia a lot. And it's a problem we may accept as long as the Senate plays a role that is not its full constitutional role. But the very moment the Senate will use all its constitutional powers, the underrepresentation of Alberta and British Columbia will put this country in a huge constitutional crisis. So Mr. Harper was irresponsible to propose to elect the Senate when there is no consensus about how we will reallocate the seats to have fairness in the Senate if the Senate is to be as powerful as the House. The second problem we will need to solve before to have an elected Senate is the powers between the Senate and the House to be sure that you have a dispute settlement mechanism. Because 2 chambers elected, speaking on behalf of the people, will clash, will oppose, will paralyze each other, and we need to find a way to solve these problems. Otherwise, we'll import in Canada the difficulties you see in US. Now, about abolition, there is no consensus about abolition, and maybe it's not the best way to act with our Senate. I would argue that the best way we may act with our Senate is to make our Senate closer to what the fathers of Confederation wanted our Senate to be, which is to be a chamber of sober second thought, something that many of us has described in this conference since this morning. And this description of the Senate to be a chamber of sober second thought suppose, as Simon has said, that senators stop to be whipped. They are independent from the whips that you have in the House, both from the House of, from the Conservative, from the Liberals, from any party. The Senate has been able to play its role, not perfectly, far from it, but in a valuable way over the decades until it has been imposed a partisan discipline as we have ever seen in the past. Professor Andrew just told us that Andrew Hurd came with a study that I have here facing me that shows that between 1994 and 2008, the Senate amended about 1 bill out of 10 and vetoed only 2 bills. Maybe some will say it's 2 bills, 2 more. They should never veto. But at least only 2 bills out of 465. So it's really a chamber of sober second thought that scrutinized the role of the House. The problem we have now is that the Senate is completely unable to do this role because the party discipline that is imposed to the Senate is without any precedent in the past. Also, you have the sense that the Senate is chosen with too much patronage, and so we need some reform. What we are proposing with Justin Trudeau is to come back to what the Senate was supposed to be, a chamber that scrutinized legislative proposals in order to detect their errors, shortcomings, and inaccuracies, and based on its findings, to suggest useful amendments. We liberals will see that the Senate will play its constitutional role, an upper chamber, attuned to the needs and aspirations of the regions and minorities of our diverse country, including First Nations and official language communities. The plan of Mr. Trudeau is built on two phases. The first one is already completed. It has been done. Now the senators are not part of the Liberal caucus anymore. They are not whipped. They have no organic links with the leader and his office. They don't have any responsibilities in the organization of the Liberal Party of Canada or for the financing of the Liberal Party of Canada. As private citizens, they are free to continue to be liberals, and Mr. Cohen will be a liberal all his life, I have no doubt about that. But that's a huge change. We should not underestimate what that means. And if Mr. Harper was proposing the same for the Conservative senators, all of a sudden the Senate would be much closer to all the reforms we spoke about since this morning. But unfortunately, Mr. Harper refused, and in fact, the less the Liberal senators are whipped, the more the Conservatives one, it seems, became. And that's unfortunate. So this is, to me, the most significant Senate reform since Confederation that has been done by Mr. Trudeau, but it's only half of it. The other part is to have a non-partisan senatorial appointment process so that the Senate is made up of outstanding, highly qualified, devoted legislators. Most constitutional experts that I have consulted have suggested that a good way to proceed would be to establish a senatorial advisory council, a bit like the one you have in UK. The proposed council would be tasked with providing the Prime Minister with informed, objective advice on possible Senate appointees. And personally, I think it's a model that can be considered among others, but a model, very interesting one. So the council would base its recommendations on sound, objective, non-partisan criteria. The recommended candidates would have to demonstrate a comprehensive list of qualities: exceptional competence, indisputable connections with the province, a history of outstanding service to their communities, an exceptional work capacity, flawless honesty and integrity, open-mindedness, the wisdom and sound judgment expected from a legislator, and full understanding of what a chamber of sober second thought is supposed to do, proposing improvements to legislation without disputing the legitimate lead role of the elected house in a democracy. Care would be taken to ensure fair representation of women, minorities, including First Nations and official language communities who have historical ties to the Senate. How it may work concretely, a proposition would be that this advisory council would come with a shortlist. The Prime Minister may pick a choice in the shortlist or reject the shortlist. The Prime Minister will have to explain why he's not comfortable with the shortlist. And then it will be for the council to come with another shortlist until the Prime Minister is satisfied and come with a recommendation to the Governor General. So that's a possible model. I think it would improve a lot. The Prime Minister would have to justify his or her choices, and he would be informed much more than today about the possibilities to appoint great legislators. An act of Parliament enacted such a selected process would be fully constitutional. It would not change what the Supreme Court of Canada called in its ruling in 2014 the Senate fundamental nature and role. What the court said is that we cannot, the Parliament, cannot change unilaterally the nature of the Senate. And in order to know if we are doing it, the court said, and I will quote the court said that the framers of the Constitution Act 1982 extended the constitutional protection provided by the general amending procedure to the entire process by which senators are selected. That means that the court will consider the whole process of selection in order to know if we are changing the nature of the Senate. It's why Mr. Harper's proposal to have optional elections by provinces was considered as non-constitutional because it was changing the character of the Senate, making it an elected body instead of being a chamber of sober second thought. What Mr. Trudeau is proposing, to the contrary, will strengthen the character of the actual Senate, will make the Senate that we have closer to what it's supposed to be according the Constitution, John A. Macdonald, and the Supreme Court of Canada. And I will quote the court again, to provide sober second thought on the legislation adopted by the popular representatives in the House of Commons, to be a thoroughly independent body which could canvass dispassionately the measures of the House of Commons, a complementary legislative body rather than a perennial rival of the House of Commons in the legislative process, removed from the partisan political arena. So the more you're close to this description of the Supreme Court, the more you're close to the Trudeau model, and it's why it's completely constitutional. This being said, I believe it would be wise to experiment with the new process before entrenching it in an act of Parliament in order to test its uptake, to make the adjustments, to have the feedback of everyone, including the experts we have in this room, to see how we may improve it before to come with the status. To conclude, I will just say that Justin Trudeau's commitment to give Canada an effective, less partisan, and more independent upper house is realistic and much needed. Without having to change a single word in the Constitution, it will deliver a Senate populated with senators with the skills, knowledge, and ability to fulfill the task assigned to the institution by the Fathers of Confederation. The Senate will be better equipped to scrutinize and improve the legislative work of the House of Commons. The Trudeau plan for Senate reform will deliver a Senate that is worthy of the pride and confidence of Canadians, a true chamber of sober second thought. It is indeed time for boldness. It is time for an effective and non-partisan Senate. It is time for the Trudeau plan for Senate reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephane, and ably done within the 15-minute parameter. And now, Mr. Rajotte.
Thank you very much. Thank all of you for being here today. I want to thank the organizers for putting this wonderful session together. I was just able to observe the last session. I'm afraid I wasn't able to observe the earlier ones. I do want to welcome my colleagues here today. Bienvenue Edmonton. You have before you two of the most distinguished constitutional legal experts in the House of Commons, and you have me. So I will do my best to live up to this. In discussing appearing with Arisia, I said, well, as Anne mentioned, and thank you so much for that those very kind words. I appreciate that very much, and congratulations on being named Chancellor. It's very, very, very high praise. I do hope you will continue to cheer for the U of A in this sporting event. But as she mentioned, I'm not in cabinet, so I cannot presume to speak for the government. But Arisia said, well, come and present some ideas of your own in terms of what should be done on Senate reform, and be bold. So I will certainly attempt to do that. I do just want to state at the outset, I was frankly disappointed with the Supreme Court decision in the sense of I thought it limited too much in terms of what kind of reform we could have. That's just my own personal perspective on that. I thought it was too limiting. I think we should be able to do more reform than that. I could certainly go into that in the question and answer session. My preference is and always has been for wholesale reform. I am one of those people who believe in a Triple E Senate. I do think the Senate should be elected. I think we are one of the only democracies, certainly one of the only Westminster democracies with an elected Senate, as well with the UK, but I think we should endeavor to move to an elected Senate. We should endeavor to move, as the gentleman from British Columbia said, to some way remedy the equal part, to say that British Columbia with its population has 6 senators and provinces with less than 1 million people have 10 senators. I don't think there's any sort of equity that one can find in that formula. And we should have a discussion about effectiveness, and I'll come to that later, but I am open to a discussion on that as well. I do want to just highlight, and I know you've talked probably at length in terms of what the government's efforts were in terms of reform, as was described. It was described earlier in terms of allowing for elections at the provincial level, and the second is for term limits, and as has been correctly described, the Supreme Court did render its decision on those. My sense of what the Prime Minister was trying to do is actually what Anne McClellan sort of said at the end of that panel, which is to create a bit of, I wouldn't know if I'd say messiness, but a bit of discord such that provinces and the country and the Senate and the House of Commons said, okay, it's untenable the way it is now. It's untenable, mixed. We have some elected, some non-elected. We do need to have wholesale reform of the Senate as an institution. So there was a provision to allow for provinces to allow for elections. Alberta did move in that direction. None of the other provinces, to be fair, did move to that as all. My preference was to have, still on the elected side, is to do elections at the federal level rather than through the provincial level. In terms of term limits, I thought it was reasonable to say that the government ought to be able to, or the country ought to be able to put some kind of a term limit on in terms of the Senate. I think, in fact, lowering it to 75, this is one of the questions I do have about the Supreme Court decision, is why was it acceptable to lower it to 75 through the government itself, but not acceptable? And if you look at the questions to the Supreme Court, it wasn't just about 9 years, it was about some other provisions as well. Why is it not acceptable then to, without going to the provinces, for 750 or 10 provinces agreeing, why can the federal parliament not make those changes? That's a question perhaps the constitutional experts in the room can address that. But I think it was an attempt to do it incrementally. It was also recognition. We had 2 minority governments. We had 3 in a row, but 2 conservative minority governments. It was also an effort to move incrementally such that try to win more people over to Senate reform as a concept. It was not successful, and obviously the Supreme Court has rendered its decision. So those are not options now, but that's just sort of explaining what the government, or what the Prime Minister was trying to do. So what should we do now? It seems to me there's 4 options. Is 1, leave the Senate as is. Secondly, try to broadly reform the Senate. Thirdly, abolish the Senate, which Craig will speak very ably to. Or fourthly, try to do some modest reforms. The Supreme Court decision in terms of consent of the provinces, the challenge there, and this is where I would agree with Stephane, and it is very challenging. It will be very challenging to get provincial consensus, even the 750, on any sort of Senate reform at this time. But I think we should still make an effort. My sense is, politically, is that there's almost more support at the provincial level for abolition. There's probably most support for simply doing nothing or staying with the status quo, but there's probably more support with the Premier of Saskatchewan. Certainly the former Premier of Ontario will be very strong in terms of abolition. So my recommendation would be, though, because I do favor wholesale reform, is that after the next election, I don't think it's reasonable to do this before the next election, is that whoever is Prime Minister is to formally, in some way, approach the provinces and say, is there any appetite whatsoever for any kind of reform to the Senate? Obviously, I would favor my model, but frankly, I'm open to more of a discussion in terms of what should happen. I'm not a big fan, frankly, of the federal provincial conferences that we used to have in this country, and both under Conservative and Liberal governments, but in some way, having the provinces state and go on the record. Are they in favor of abolition? Why? Are they in favor of any sort of reform to the institution in terms of its powers, in terms of its whether it should be elected or not, and in terms of some kind of equity? And to address the equity question, I'm frankly open. Whether it's provincial equity or whether it's regional equity, I would accept different models of both. I think a lot of Canadians are, if it's 5 regions plus the territories, they'd be open to that. If it's equal provincial equality, I think there's less support for that, especially as you get to larger provinces like Quebec and Ontario. But my sense is there should be some formal process whereby the Government of Canada puts a question to the provinces in terms of what they would accept or not. Determine then if there is a consensus. Is there a consensus as to a way to move forward? If there's no consensus, which it'd be hard at this point to see a consensus forming, but if there's no consensus, then I would agree with, I think it's Professor Hurd. I think, frankly, that is sort of the secondary option, which is, I'm not in favor of abolition because I'm in favor of a bicameral legislature, but the second option then to me would be to do some kind of set of modest reforms, to look to the House of Lords as an institution that we should try to move towards. At least this would be an improvement over the current model in my view. Some kind of an agreement on the makeup of Senate. And if you look at the way the House of Lords is constituted, essentially, roughly I think it's 40% Conservative, 40% Labour, 20% crossbencher. So no one party has a majority in the House of Lords. And this seems to work fairly well in the sense of it is a less partisan body because it's not one party gets into power, fills it up so they obtain the majority. Then the next party gets in, fights with the Senate over the next number of years, and then strives to achieve a majority in that chamber as well. There's convention, whether it's a Labour government or whether it's a Conservative government, is to abide by that 40-40-20. And within the 20%, you have your Liberal Democratic, you have your Lib Dem crossbenchers, but you also have a number of distinguished members of the United Kingdom who achieve a certain status in their field and are then put in that chamber to provide expertise on certain issues. As you know, they used to have, now they have a separate Supreme Court, but they used to have the Supreme Court used to exist within the House of Lords. Now it's a separate institution under the Labour government reforms. But the crossbenchers, you look at people like Dr. Lauren Terrell, who's University of Alberta, medical research, not a partisan person, not somebody who's going to go to Ottawa and be partisan one way or another, but he will be there. If you have questions on medical research, he is somebody who obviously would be able to be consulted on that. A former chief of defense staff put Rick Hillier in the Senate so that he could provide a lot of advice, expertise on military matters. So you have sort of a combination of that expertise as well as people who are appointed from a party political point of view as well. I would say, though, the one challenge that I'll raise to myself on that issue is that in the UK they do things much more by agreement, by convention, by their culture. In Canada, we seem to require more writing things down and coming to agreement before we do so. So that would certainly be one challenge for that as well. I do want to address just the issue of partisanship and party whips, and I know it's a big controversy, and I think, frankly, Rissi, probably the next conference you could have is Boldness on House of Commons reform. I would say this, frankly, I was a little surprised, Senator Cowan, in terms of how the Senate works. I don't have a strong sense of how Senate committees work, but when it's mentioned that parties who are not a majority party do not have the opposition to present witnesses before a committee. Now maybe it's particular to the Finance Committee, but the study we did this past week at Finance Committee was based on a motion presented by an NDP member, Nathan Cullen, who's the vice chair, and it was unanimously agreed to by all the committee members. If you look at our past studies, tax evasion was proposed by the NDP, income equality was proposed by the Liberals, charitable donations was proposed by the Conservatives. Every time we study an issue, this week, we heard from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, we heard from the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, but we heard from the Canadian Labour Congress and Unifor. And Unifor and the Canadian Labour Congress, I won't surprise you, were not suggested by the Conservatives. We always take witnesses from all three political parties on the committee. So I think, frankly, it's more incumbent upon ourselves in terms of whether we accept that level or whip or not. And one thing we should point to is the House of Commons reform. This actually happened when Paul Martin was Prime Minister, I believe, and is that he brought in sort of the three-stage whip, which we use as a party, and I think other parties still use, which is for one-line whip, it's a completely free vote. Two-line, it means the cabinet votes in favor of it. They recommend on the Conservative benches, obviously members vote in favor, but I'm not a cabinet member, so I can vote against a two-line whip. Three-line whip is on budgetary matters where if I were to vote against a budget or a 3-line whip, obviously there'd be repercussions. So we use that system in the House of Commons now, but it's whether you accept that or not, frankly. I think we often, as members of Parliament, say, oh, I was whipped on this matter. I choose to stand up or not whenever I do. I choose to say whatever I do or not. I choose to conduct myself accordingly. And I think, frankly, that's more an answer to partisanship and party line and that's why I would partly very strongly favor the moving to election of the Senate, is because people can phone me each and every day and challenge me and say, why did you vote in favor of that bill? I realize you're a conservative, but I want you to explain to me as your constituent why you voted in favor of that bill or against that bill or not. So that's for the next conference, but I will wrap up now. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having invited me. I also want to acknowledge my colleague MP, Linda Duncan, who's the MP for Edmonton Strathcona, who's with us today as well. We sit close to each other in the House, and she'll be driving me to the airport right after this, so we can share some more war stories. I'm going to, if I get through all 5, I'm going to present sort of this informative 5 theses. And the first one's going to sound off the wall. Thesis 1, from the NDP's perspective of wanting to see the Senate abolished, the most important democratic reform is reform of how we elect MPs to the House of Commons. Now let me explain that. Right now, although there's a fair degree of support across the country, that doesn't take much for it to resurface for getting rid of the Senate, at least the Senate as it currently operates, etc. A lot of people might want to replace it, but there are a number of understandings of what the Senate's functions are supposed to be. People believe them in different degrees that they do or they don't, but one of the ones that's begun to surface a lot is that the Senate is somehow a check on a broken House of Commons. And when you get to what is it that's broken about the House of Commons, it's the majoritarian dominance of the House of Commons after an election in which well under 50% of the votes have been cast for the party that gets well over 50% of the seats. And that does allow a minded government to force through legislation based on purely one-sided approaches. And James is a very unique chair, I'll tell you this right now, and we all know that in the House of Commons. There are maybe 3 or 4 others who operate in the mode and there's the openness in the committee that is in the Finance Committee. And so it's not just been the current 10 years, it's been previous governments, Chrétien majorities. So the idea that you need the Senate because we have problematic majority governments that can actually just force their will on the rest of the House, and indeed on the Canadians who voted for well over 50% of the other MPs who were in the minority, is something that comes up more and more. What will you do if the Senate goes? How will you provide any check to the House of Commons? I'm not going to go into whether the Senate provides any serious check to the House of Commons. In my view, it doesn't. In my view, it does some good work, very good work, and on occasion it's provided a check. But more often than not, recent examples such as the gender identity bill suggest that it thwarts the House of Commons more than anything else. So we need a system of proportional representation. The NDP is proposing mixed member proportional in order to begin to create the kind of House of Commons that will give people the comfort level to no longer have a Senate, so that people will be comfortable with a unicameral system. And that's the first premise. I'm going to come back to that if I have time at the end. Second thesis is that part of reforming the House of Commons, proportional representation helps engender a whole set of new dynamics and potential political cultural patterns. More collegiality, more role. Mixed member proportional representation, for reasons I don't have time to go into, actually will increase the independence of local MPs because of the way in which people can now, under the system we want, tick, this is who I want to be my local MP, and then tick, who do I want to come in from a list to make sure the parties are represented in the House in accordance with their vote. They don't have to vote for the same party. Under that system, members of Parliament will increasingly go to the House with more cross-community and cross-partisan support. There are ways in which proportional representation, especially MMP, will help create a healthier House of Commons. But what if we were to say the Senate does carry out a number of extremely good functions? Whether they have or haven't, we can debate. How many senators actually carry these out in different periods of time, we can debate. But there are ways of grafting, either mostly statutorily, some of the functions that the Senate performs onto the House of Commons in ways that will probably be an awful lot more economical in terms of the overall costs than at present. I'm going to leave my examples. I've got a number of examples. Some of them are off-the-wall examples of what could possibly be done. I work with a panel of advisors on constitutional matters and the constitutionality of how new statutory mechanisms that would assume some of the Senate's functions when it comes to providing close technical reading of bills that often get missed by the House of Commons. The other major one would be we need a system in Parliament where we have thorough review by experts in an advisory capacity of the constitutionality of bills, whether it's from a Charter of Rights perspective, Division of Powers, Aboriginal rights perspective. We have a Mickey Mouse parliamentary situation right now where it's theoretically the Minister of Justice who is informed to a very low standard of whether something is likely to get through the courts or not. And we have no transparency whatsoever of whether what kind of analysis was done on bills. We need something resembling preview. Now the Senate on occasion does perform that role. It's more likely than not these days that the senators will raise constitutional questions. And I think that we need something grafted onto the House of Commons to actually make sure that the upfront first, second, and third reading and committee process is much better informed that way. Third thesis, to want the Senate abolished doesn't mean, here I've actually prepared my notes more carefully, one does not mean that one does not want it to operate within a more democratic framework. There are a range of what I call interim measures that can and should be taken by the Senate, including by way of statute originating from the House of Commons, to challenge the Senate to adopt the measures that would be in that statute. Otherwise, it could occur by pressure and discussion and maybe a degree of collegiality that at the moment doesn't exist between, say, my party and the Senate at the moment. Now, I had an October 2013 motion in the House of Commons that read as follows, that in the opinion of this House, urgent steps must be taken to improve accountability in the Senate, and therefore this House call for the introduction of immediate measures to end senators' partisan activities, including participation in caucus meetings, and to limit senators' travel allowances to those activities clearly and directly related to parliamentary business. So what Stephane is calling the greatest innovation in Senate reform since Confederation, when performed by Mr. Trudeau 3 months later, was there to be voted on by both Liberals and Conservatives in the House of Commons after a day's debate, and both the Liberals and the Conservatives chose not to. An awful lot changed in those 3 months. But the point is that those are the kinds of things that do need to take place. So now that it's happening, now that something has taken place from the Liberal side, it's to be welcomed. So there are a host of steps that can be taken to amend the Parliament Act, Senate rules, Senate administrative rules, and some other acts. I have a list now that I'm playing with that's now reached 40 different amendments that would not require constitutional change, but would require almost all of them Senate consent. So that's where the whole issue of Senate's internal reform would come in. And let me mention just a few. From the symbolic to the transformative, out of the list that we're considering. For the moment, consider this to be my own personal musings or ravings. A lot of this could be caught by a kind of a senatorial pledge or code of conduct. Some of this stuff need not actually be in statute form, but it could be done in the form of a code of conduct. But if the Senate is not interested in some of these things, it might have to be proposed in a sort of a pressure-like way through legislation to try to get them to that point. Here's one. So no senator may engage in any of the following activity: political party organizing, election campaigning, fundraising, or partisan advocacy, including delivering speeches at MP events. Another one, senators must indicate on their Senate website page whether they are a member of a political party, and if so, name that party, and also list any political donations they've made to the political party within their annual personal limit. Not prohibiting it, just saying transparency. Third, no senator may engage in travel at Senate expense unless the travel is demonstrably to assist the senator in carrying out her functions as a senator, which functions do not include personal business or the very widely defined partisan reasons that until now have been in place. So we basically have to narrow what actually it means to have a parliamentary function lying behind travel. 4, all senators must resign from party caucuses and also not attend any informal meetings that substitute for weekly party caucus meetings, especially with their MP colleagues. Sort of caucuses of interest, etc., are a very different thing. Any senator who meets or communicates with government officials or ministers for anything that would reasonably be perceived as lobbying, if done by a non-senator, shall voluntarily register as a lobbyist. And then we could also talk about actually changing the Lobbying Act. And here's key. 2 key ones. Senators must voluntarily pledge to vote for legislation coming to the Senate in its final form from the Commons, where the final form means that senators may vote for amendments to Commons legislation when it first comes to the Senate, but then must vote for the legislation when it returns to the Senate, including if returned in unamended form. That's very close to what the Constitutional Convention already is, but that seems to get fragmented every few years to the point it's hard to know whether there is that convention. However, should senators wish to make clear that they object to the substance of the legislation, even though they voted yes in accordance with their pledge not to thwart the will of the House of Commons, they may explain their objections by way of something like a qualified yes at the time of the vote or immediately after in writing, so that there's a record to say, yes, I'm carrying out the structural duty to vote yes, but I have problems with this bill. A lot of ethics rules are going to have to be changed, but that's probably also the case in the House of Commons. I'll skip those. Parliament of Canada Act. The sections that take as given the institutions of government and opposition leaders, whips, deputy leaders, and deputy whips should be repealed. Then the particular section, section 62(1) of the Parliament of Canada Act, has to be amended to add the following, and this is where I have a scheme that I won't go into great detail. The following 6 positions: government spokesperson in the Senate, 2 deputy government spokespersons in the Senate, a Senate leader, and 2 deputy Senate leaders. And you can imagine, Senator Cowan, who sort of lives the Senate, could imagine how that might map onto a new way that the Senate could be organized, where the Senate House leader is actually somebody who is elected by the body, other senators. The spokesperson in the Senate serves the role, the government spokesperson role will serve the current role of the government House leader, et cetera, et cetera. Any rules relating to the practice of whipping senators, what an awful word that we use, in parliamentary Westminster tradition shall be eliminated, as well as all other references to party discipline. The Speaker shall be elected by secret ballot by senators and no longer a prime ministerial appointment. New definitions of parliamentary functions, I'll leave that. There's a range of others, but let me now get into the symbolic, and this is what people say, this is not the symbolic. Yeah, got this one too. It's maybe the petty, the NDP petty, but one is, I would personally love to see the speech from the throne move to the House of Commons from the Senate. For all kinds of reasons to do with the symbolism involved. And people might not know that in legislative drafting, the Senate always comes before the House of Commons. In the order of precedence, in terms of where people are in ceremonies, etc., the Speaker of the Senate comes before the Speaker of the House of Commons. There's actually a whole range of these symbolic items that I think are archaic affronts to the fact that we live in a 21st century democracy. And we could get some traction with just starting with some of those things. The last thing is, I would say, I believe that not long after the next Parliament is formed, we should consider a Supreme Court reference, not wait the 6-7 years that Mr. Harper did on his Senate reference, but a reference that would go up to the the Supreme Court with all the reasonable questions where people are making claims that if you want to do that, it's unconstitutional. Get it all cleared in advance. That includes some of what may be proposed by the Liberals on appointments that some would interpret the Senate reference as not allowing. It would include things like how long can we not appoint senators, which of course Tom Mulcair has said he won't appoint any senators on the road to abolition. Can he do that? For how long can he do that, et cetera? There's a whole range of these questions that I think need to be put on the table, and we have to use the Supreme Court earlier rather than later. The last thing, that was Thesis 4, is Thesis 5, and I won't go into detail. It's simply that abolition, which I've not talked about. I just assume you all know enough about why we might want it abolished, and it's not necessarily the focus of this conference. Abolition is often treated not as a reform. It's some other beast. But in fact, it's the boldest reform, even if it is also in some respects the least complex as compared to what, say, James might want. We should not be afraid of our constitutional shadow. Stephane's heard me say this before. I do believe that ever since the near-death experiences coming out of Meech Lake and Charlottetown and leading to a referendum in Quebec and Pierre-Elliott Trudeau reappearing in different incarnations to fight keeping the Constitution the way it was as of 1982, has created this fear of God, where God is the Constitution, in this country. The Senate can be abolished if we accept that a Constitution is the property of the people, and that it takes leadership and not just predicting where people are at now. And if any Prime Minister is capable of marshalling the federal-provincial consensus to do it, it would be Tom Mulcair. And so I'll leave it at that.
So thank you to a rousing political panel. Now